The first thing you need to know about living in Aspen Knoll is that no one here actually likes aspen trees. Or knolls, for that matter. It's flat, it's humid, and the closest thing we have to native vegetation is the perfect chemically induced emerald blanket they call lawn. I call it a tragedy. And they call me, well, they call me the problem. I'm Miles, 35, single, and the only guy on Primrose Lane who refuses to surrender his soul and his backyard to the tyranny of the neighborhood association. They say a man's home is his castle. In Aspen Knoll, your home is a display model, and your backyard must pass daily inspection by Brenda. Brenda is the NA president, and let me tell you, if the Stepford Wives had a drill sergeant, she'd be wearing Brenda's sensible beige trousers. She's the kind of woman who measures the exact circumference of a shrub with a ruler just to make sure you're violating the rules by an equal, symmetrical amount. My personal act of defiance, my humble, slightly chaotic, totally glorious middle finger to conformity, is what I affectionately call the swamp. It started innocently enough back in 2024 swarm. I looked at my perfectly manicured, hydro-seeded, utterly sterile 0.4-acre plot and felt nothing but existential dread. So, I ripped out the grass. All of it. Instead of approved ornamental cabbage and prefab paving stones, I planted heirloom tomatoes, zucchini that grew with the aggressive confidence of a weed, and sunflowers that towered over the fence, brazenly shedding pollen everywhere. I even let a corner turn into a sort of muddy, low-lying area, because, honestly, the drainage here sucks, and fighting physics seemed like too much work. It was an ecosystem, a food source, and most importantly, a giant, visible mess. It was glorious. It was also, according to the official notice I received today, an unauthorized horticultural hazard. The confrontation happened precisely at 3:00 p.m. because Brenda is nothing if not punctual, like a very unhappy German cuckoo clock. I was out back, wrestling with a cucumber vine that was trying to colonize my deck furniture, when I heard the dreaded click-clack of her kitten heels on my approved HOA-compliant driveway pavers. I instinctively grabbed my gardening gloves, which I hadn't washed since the day I planted them, just for dramatic effect. I walked around to the front yard. Brenda was standing there, radiating disapproval like a faulty microwave. Next to her was Gary, the NA vice president, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Gary is just background radiation. He just carries the clipboard and tries not to look Miles in the eye. "Miles," Brenda began, her voice possessing that chillingly calm tone that only precedes the complete destruction of your afternoon. "We are here regarding the continuing and egregious violation of Covenants Section 3B, Subsection 7, pertaining to approved exterior flora and visual standards." "Brenda," I replied, pulling off a glove and patting a clump of dirt into my hair. "To what do I owe the distinct, highly chlorinated pleasure? Did one of my basil plants win a beauty contest the NA didn't authorize?" Gary managed a tiny, wheezing cough that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle, and Brenda fixed him with a laser beam of a stare. Gary immediately looked down and shuffled his feet. Poor guy. "This is not a joke, Miles. The board has received no fewer than 12 complaints about your jungle." She spat the word out like it was a hairball. She held up a pristine white, tri-folded piece of paper. "This is a formal notice of violation and intent to impose fines. It also serves as a final warning." I took the paper. It was thick, glossy stock, naturally. They probably had to approve the font and paperweight in a separate 6-hour meeting. "Let's see here," I murmured, scanning the text while trying to look appropriately concerned. "Weed overgrowth, unapproved fencing material. That's just chicken wire. Brenda, chickens need infrastructure. And oh, here we go. Visual blight and detriment to community property values." Wow. Did you guys hire a poet? The board is serious, Miles. The aesthetic integrity of Aspen Knoll is paramount. We have given you 30 days to completely remove the existing, unauthorized vegetation, till the soil, and either resod with Kentucky bluegrass or install an approved, neutral-toned rock garden. You may select from 2 shades of river rock. I folded the notice into a paper airplane and then unfolded it again, slowly. 30 days. That's harsh. You know, those heirloom tomatoes are just about ready to fruit. I was going to donate the surplus to the local food bank, but I guess fighting hunger is a detriment to community property values, right? Brenda wasn't fazed. "You may remove the produce, but the root system and all remaining unapproved flora must be eliminated. If this area is not compliant by the deadline, the NA will hire a contractor to perform the work and charge the entire expense, plus administrative fees, directly to your account. Do you understand?" I looked past her, across the street, at the perfectly manicured, totally identical yards. They were lawns that whispered of conformity and silent despair. Then I looked back at my backyard. My messy, buzzing, beautiful disaster. It was teeming with life, and most importantly, it was mine. A slow, utterly inappropriate smile spread across my face. I looked Brenda directly in her cold, determined eyes. "I understand completely, Brenda," I said, leaning in just a little. "You want me to get rid of my garden. You want me to erase this whole unauthorized horticultural hazard." "That is correct." "And you're going to hit me with fines and hire your own people if I don't comply." "That is absolutely correct, Miles. This is your last chance," I sighed, running a hand through my dirty hair. "Well, that presents a problem, because this isn't just a garden, Brenda. It's not just a collection of vegetables, and it certainly isn't an unauthorized horticultural hazard." Gary flinched. Brenda raised an eyebrow, the single most movement I'd seen from her all week. "What is it then, Miles? A highly protected shrine to poor taste?" "No, ma'am," I said, putting on my glove again, the dirt instantly grounding me. "It's an ecosystem, and after giving it some serious thought and consulting the law, I'm pretty sure I can't touch it. None of us can." Brenda's lips thinned into a razor-straight line. "Don't be ridiculous. This is a residential subdivision, not the Amazon. You have 30 days, Miles. That timeline is non-negotiable." She turned to leave, clicking away, Gary scrambling to catch up, his clipboard wobbling. I watched them go, a single, potent thought bubbling up from the well of suburban rage in my heart. They wanted rules. They wanted regulations. They wanted a legal precedent. "Lady, you just challenged the wrong guy. This isn't a garden, it's a statement, and in 30 days it's going to be a federal case." I turned back to the swamp, gave the cucumber vine a high five, and started sketching a highly elaborate sign in the dirt. I was going to need a bigger fence, and maybe some waiters. The war for the backyard had officially begun, and I was about to find out that petty spite, when combined with obscure government bureaucracy, can be a surprisingly potent weapon. 30 days, huh? Challenge accepted. 30 days. 30 days is not a lot of time to defeat a small-town despot armed with a laminated copy of the bylaws and an army of compliant grass fanatics. But 30 days is exactly how long I had to transform my highly unsanctioned garden into something untouchable, something sacred, something federal. My first move, however, had to be a feigned attempt at compliance. I needed to look like the good guy, the victim of overzealous enforcement. Also, I genuinely wanted to see the look on a professional contractor's face when I pitched the job. I scheduled appointments with 3 different landscaping companies for the decommissioning of my yard. I called the work the Great Ungardening, and I tried to sound as mournful as possible over the phone, though I suspect the sarcasm was thicker than the sludge under my zucchini plants. The first guy was Jerry from Lawn and Order. Jerry rolled up in a pristine white truck, his polo shirt ironed so sharply it looked dangerous. He had a clipboard, a measuring tape, and the general air of a man who believed grass should be worshipped. "Miles, is it?" Jerry asked, shaking my hand with the damp, firm grip of a real estate agent. "Brenda from the NA gave me a call. Said you had a bit of a situation back here. Something about native growth?" "Jerry, it's worse than that," I sighed, dramatically, leading him through the narrow gate and into the glorious mess of the swamp. Jerry stopped dead. His jaw hung open a little. I could practically hear the clink of his perfectly manicured business model hitting the dirt. "Well, bless my heart," he muttered. "This is robust." "Robust? Jerry, this is a crisis of conscience. This is a botanical tragedy," I lamented. "They're forcing me to remove it, and I need a specific, highly professional service." Jerry adjusted his safety glasses. "Right. We can clear this out in a day. Skid steer, haul it away. Lay down some pre-approved sod. Done." No, I interrupted, waving my hands wildly. "You misunderstand the brief. See, I need proof that every single piece of this, every root, every beetle, every grain of soil, is being treated with the utmost respect. I need to be able to present this to the NA to show them I truly suffered." Jerry blinked. "Sir, we just shovel it and dump it." "Unacceptable," I cried. "I need a botanical archaeology team on site. I want the site to be devegetated by hand. I need an itemized inventory of every species of earthworm displaced. I need a final report on the soil's exact pre-destruction pH level, and most importantly, I need a signed affidavit from the crew chief confirming that they, individually and collectively, felt a profound sense of loss during the process." Jerry stared at me for a long, silent moment. He looked at his clipboard, then back at the zucchini, then back at me. "Look, buddy," he finally said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I charge $90 an hour for a 2-man crew and a bobcat. What you're asking for sounds like a PhD dissertation that ends in a group therapy session. I can't do any of that." "So you're telling me you can't professionally certify the precise level of spiritual damage done to the ecosystem during its mandated annihilation?" I asked, leaning in with theatrical disappointment. Jerry packed up his measuring tape. "I'm telling you, this is nuts. My quote is $4,500 just to clear the debris and $1,200 for the sod. The grief counseling is extra, and I don't provide it." He walked away quickly, muttering something about certified organic lunacy. Total quotes received. 1. Total interest in my project. 0. The second contractor, a gruff fellow named Rico, lasted about 6 minutes longer. When I told him the work must be done using only sustainably sourced, hand-whittled wooden spades, and that the remains must be transported in a biodegradable vessel to a composting site within a specific zip code outside the state of New Jersey. I just picked New Jersey, seemed fitting. Rico just scoffed. "Look, I got a backhoe and a dump truck, man. I don't got a Viking funeral for your tomato plants. Get out of here." The third guy, Mr. Henderson, was the most bureaucratic. He came in a sedan, wore a tie, and had an MBA in landscaping. He listened patiently as I explained that the destruction needed to be filmed, edited, and scored with mournful violin music, suitable for presentation to the NA, as an avant-garde short film titled Requiem for a Radish. Henderson didn't laugh. He just took notes. "I see," he said, tapping his pen on the pad. "So, you're asking for a Level 5 decommissioning with full artistic mitigation compliance. That will require hiring an external consulting firm, a videographer, and legal counsel to draft the liability waivers for the artistic performance. I'd estimate, Miles, that the clearance alone, before sodding and assuming all permits for the film crew are acquired, will be in the ballpark of $25,000. $25,000? I yelled, completely forgetting my mournful persona. To dig up some basil? It's the process you're paying for, Miles. Not the basil. It's the peace of mind that every step was performed with the legally mandated solemnity you requested. Right. Got it. I'll be in touch, I said, shooing him off before he could try to charge me for the air he breathed while quoting the price. Conclusion of contractor. Conundrum. The exercise proved two things. 1, I am excellent at making absurd demands, and 2, the NA would never find a compliant contractor to do the work because I had intentionally made the process illegal, uneconomical, or emotionally damaging. I was stalling, but stalling wasn't enough. I needed a bazooka, not a squirt gun. The fines, predictably, started rolling in. The first one arrived via certified mail, $250 for unapproved vegetation height and unsanctioned natural growth. The check was accompanied by a passive-aggressive note from Brenda, reminding me that the fine doubled every week until compliance was achieved. This, naturally, brought us to the dreaded NA meeting. The Aspen Knoll NA meeting is held every month in the sterile, harshly lit community clubhouse. It's where dreams go to die, and where neighbors get to stab each other in the back with perfectly civil smiles. I decided to attend the meeting armed with the only 2 weapons I possessed: sarcasm and a thick folder of highly specific, legally dubious documents. I sat in the back row next to Leo, my only true ally in this suburban hellscape. Leo is a programmer who lives down the street and views the NA primarily as an inefficient operating system that needs a serious bug fix. "You look like you're ready for court-martial, buddy," Leo whispered, fiddling with his phone. "I am," I whispered back. I brought printouts of the USDA's official definition of a weed, just in case. Spoiler alert. The NA's definition is anything that's not grass or one of Brenda's approved petunias. The meeting started with announcements about the upcoming annual garage sale, mandatory participation, naturally, and a lengthy discussion about the correct color for mailbox posts. Apparently mine was 0.003% too dark. Then Brenda arrived at the topic she clearly enjoyed most: the Miles problem. "Finally," Brenda said, standing behind the podium, her voice magnified by a terrible microphone. "We must address the continued non-compliance by one of our residents. Miles, your property at 142 Primrose Lane is now accruing serious fines for flagrant violations of the established covenants." I stood up, holding my folder like a shield. "Point of order, Madam President." Brenda looked at me like I was a piece of trash that had blown onto her perfect driveway. "Yes, Miles?" "I have submitted to the board extensive documentation proving that my garden, which you persist in calling flagrant violations, is in fact a crucial urban biodiversity incubator for native insects and pollinators. My sunflowers provide vital shade necessary for the continuation of local chlorophyll production. Where, Madam President, in the official bylaws, does it specifically prohibit the cultivation of heirloom biodiversity for the purpose of ecological remediation?" Brenda stammered slightly. The bylaws prohibit unapproved vegetation that detracts from the uniform visual standards of the community. Ah, uniform visual standards. A compelling argument, if we were discussing military barracks, I countered smoothly. But the law, in fact, is very clear. There are exemptions for ecological projects, and I'm pretty sure the City of Glendale's ordinance on pollinator protection supersedes the aesthetic preferences of this body. Have you, Madam President, reviewed the attached Metropolitan Area Pollinator Pathway Initiative document I supplied to the board, noting that my property falls directly on a designated migratory corridor? I hadn't actually supplied that document, but the bluff was glorious. Gary choked on his coffee. Brenda's eyes narrowed. Miles, that is irrelevant. You have giant squash leaves hanging over your fence. It looks trashy. Trashy is subjective, Madam President. Ecological preservation is not. Until you can point to the specific clause in the bylaws that prohibits a Stage 1 permaculture pilot project, which this is, I must assume that your fines are retaliatory and therefore unenforceable. I sat down to a smattering of awkward coughs and one audible, "Good Lord," from an elderly gentleman in the front row. The room was split. Half the people hated me for ruining their pristine view. The other half seemed to secretly enjoy watching Brenda squirm. Brenda, defeated on the regulatory front, switched tactics. The fines stand, Miles. You have until the end of the month to resolve the issue, or the NA will move forward with an immediate forced clearance, regardless of your pollinator pathway claims. This was the end of the line. Stalling was over. I had 2 weeks left. After the meeting, I met Leo at a local dive bar, the only place in a 10-mile radius that wasn't overly sanitized. We were sitting in a sticky booth nursing 2 very cheap beers. "Dude, you almost gave Brenda an aneurysm," Leo said, taking a massive gulp. "I swear I saw steam coming out of her ears when you mentioned ecological remediation. You're going down swinging, I'll give you that." "Swinging isn't enough, Leo. I need an atomic bomb," I grumbled, slamming my beer down. "She's going to hire some goon to come in and destroy everything. $2,500 in fines already. I need a permanent solution. I need an official, legally terrifying shield." Leo leaned back, staring thoughtfully at the grease stain on the ceiling. "You know, that thing you said about ecological exemptions? You were on to something. You just weren't aiming high enough." "What do you mean?" "I mean, stop messing around with city ordinances and pollinator pathways. Go federal. You want them to not touch it? You need to make touching it a felony." He took another sip, and his face lit up with a mischievous idea. "You need to declare that yard an endangered species habitat or something. Turn it into a national park. Better yet, you should tell them it's a wetland." The word hung in the air. Wetland. I stared at him. The thought was so absurd, so magnificently petty, it was perfect. The drainage in that corner was terrible. I had always assumed it was a bug, but maybe it was a feature. "A federally protected wetland," I whispered, the words tasting like victory. "Under the Army Corps of Engineers. That would bring the Clean Water Act down on their heads." "Yeah, Miles, that's real bureaucracy," Leo grinned. "That's like Level 10, final boss bureaucracy. Messing with wetlands is worse than messing with the IRS. Think about it. Massive fines, mitigation requirements, federal permits. Brenda wouldn't just have to not touch it. She'd have to protect it." That night, I didn't sleep. I fell down a bureaucratic rabbit hole, a research marathon fueled by spite and instant coffee. I learned about Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. I learned about jurisdictional determination. I learned that a wetland isn't just a swamp with alligators. It's defined by 3 factors: hydrophytic vegetation, hydric soils, and wetland hydrology. My yard had been accidentally cultivating hydrophytic vegetation, i.e., weeds that liked water, for months. The hydric soils were just that annoying, dark, silty clay that stayed soggy after rain. All I needed was the hydrology part, the specific evidence of water inundation for a certain period of time. I needed an expert. A man or woman who lived and breathed the dull, beautiful language of environmental permitting. I needed a co-conspirator who didn't know he was one. I found Dr. Alistair Sterling, P.E., an environmental consulting engineer with a firm based 40 miles away. His website was gray, his bio was dense, and he looked profoundly unhappy in his professional headshot. Perfect. I called him the next morning. "Dr. Sterling, my name is Miles, and I have a property in Aspen Knoll," I said, trying to sound suitably serious. "I believe I have a potential jurisdictional determination issue, specifically related to prior converted cropland hydrology. I've noticed some facultative wetland species near my south fence line, and I need a professional assessment before I proceed with any dredge and fill activity." I paused, letting the terrifying jargon do the heavy lifting. There was a long silence on the other end. Then a low academic voice replied, "Prior converted cropland in a suburban subdivision? That's unusual. Tell me about the standing water frequency." And for the next 20 minutes, I didn't talk about tomatoes, the NA, or Brenda. I spoke only of water tables, soil samples I'd definitely taken, and the presence of specific moisture-loving weeds I'd spent all night identifying on Wikipedia. Dr. Sterling didn't laugh. He didn't seem surprised. He sounded only mildly intrigued by the scientific anomaly. Bureaucrats, I realized, are like sharks. They only recognize the scent of specific paperwork. "I can come out for a preliminary survey next Tuesday," he said finally. "My fee for a preliminary JD assessment is $600, non-refundable. I'll need a full plat map and any historical data you have on file regarding the site's hydrology." "Absolutely, Dr. Sterling. Consider it done," I said, trying to contain the manic glee that was bubbling up. $600 was a bargain for a federal exemption. The rest of the week was spent preparing the swamp. I removed a few easily identifiable non-wetland weeds. I aggressively watered the potential wetland area for 3 days straight, after midnight, of course, so Brenda wouldn't see. And, in a stroke of absolute genius, I went to a party supply store and bought 5 highly realistic, slightly faded plastic flamingos. I planted them in the deepest, muddiest part of the potential wetland. I told Leo I was establishing a rare avian subspecies protection zone. "Why flamingos, Miles?" Leo asked over text. "Because, Leo, if you're going to lie to the government, you might as well make it artistic," I replied. "Also, they look highly protected, and nobody messes with a protected flamingo." Next Tuesday, Dr. Sterling would arrive. I was ready to weaponize environmental law. The day Dr. Alistair Sterling arrived felt less like a scientific survey and more like a federal audit of my soul. I was wearing my least sarcastic t-shirt and attempting to look like a man genuinely concerned about the hydrogeomorphology of his suburban plot. Dr. Sterling, predictably, was dressed in a pristine field vest and carrying equipment that looked far too expensive to be near my mud patch. He was the picture of detached professionalism, which I deeply appreciated. He needed to be stone-cold serious for this magnificent farce to work. "Miles," he said, nodding briefly. I appreciate the preliminary information. If you could just direct me to the area of concern. I'll need to conduct the 3-parameter test: vegetation, soil, and hydrology. Right this way, Doctor, I said, leading him to the swamp. I call this area the lower basin. It gets enthusiastic after a heavy dew, and please be mindful of the indigenous species. I gestured vaguely toward the plastic flamingos. Dr. Sterling glanced at the flamingos, logged something on his field tablet, and didn't comment. Perfect. No questions about the pink, foot-tall, non-migratory birds. This man was a machine. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in bureaucratic ritual. Miles narrated his internal monologue, which was a frenzied mixture of panic and hope. First, vegetation. Dr. Sterling began identifying the plants. He knelt and pulled out a ruler, meticulously measuring leaf structures. This here, he murmured, pointing to a weed I'd always called that floppy green stuff. Juncus effusus, facultative wetland species. And that? Typha latifolia, cattail, highly obligate wetland species. Ah, yes, the typha, I exclaimed, trying to sound like I recognized the genus, not just the word cattail. They simply appeared. I've been worried about their sudden, aggressive enthusiasm for life. Dr. Sterling made more note. Your yard is currently exhibiting a dominance of hydrophytic vegetation, Miles. That's parameter 1 achieved. Miles's internal monologue. Yes, the weeds worked. I knew that neglected patch was holding the secret to freedom. Take that, Brenda, you botanically illiterate tyrant. Next, soil. This was the scary part. Dr. Sterling pulled out a scary-looking steel auger. He drilled down, making a sound like a rusty dentist, and pulled up a narrow tube of dirt. He then took out a Munsell soil color chart, literally a book of colored paint chips, and began comparing the mud core to the chart. He paused on a specific page, frowning slightly. This is a low chroma soil, Miles. Hydric. It has that characteristic gray mottling indicative of anaerobic conditions, oxygen deprivation due to prolonged saturation. He looked up. Parameter 2 achieved. This area has been a soggy disaster for a long time. It's the sheer depth of the moisture I find so concerning, Doctor, I said, nodding solemnly. It's a very deep issue, legally speaking. Finally, hydrology. He pulled out an intimidating GPS device and a detailed map. The final parameter is the presence of water at the surface or within 12 inches of the surface for a minimum of 5% of the growing season. Based on your historical data, the low topography, and the soil indicators, I can issue a preliminary finding. This area meets the criteria for a wetland under USACE regulations. It's what we call a prior converted cropland or a potential jurisdictional wetland. I fought the urge to perform a full touchdown dance. So what you're saying, Doctor, is that my property is protected? What I'm saying is that any activity in this area, including dredging or filling, like, say, removing the vegetation and adding sod, would require a Section 404 permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Dr. Sterling stated, packing up his meticulous tools. The permitting process is lengthy, expensive, and subject to mitigation requirements. Any unpermitted disturbance is a violation of federal law. He handed me a carbon copy of his preliminary report. I will file the official determination with the Corps next week. You'll receive certified notification. I shook his hand, feeling like I had just won the Nobel Prize for spite. Thank you, Doctor. You have no idea what you've done for me, and for the local Taifa population. The certified letter arrived exactly 1 week later. It was addressed to me, Miles, and had the terrifyingly official seal of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, in the corner. The prose was dense, dry, and absolutely glorious. The key paragraph, highlighted with a manic yellow highlighter, read, "The determined area of 0.15 acres, as delineated by consulting engineer Alistair Sterling, is confirmed to be an area of jurisdictional wetlands, subject to the regulations and oversight of the USACE under the Federal Clean Water Act. Any unauthorized dredge, fill, or disturbance activity may result in fines of up to $40,000 per day per violation and immediate cessation of work." I framed it immediately. I didn't even use a cheap frame. I went to a proper framer and got museum-quality glass. The day the 30-day deadline expired, I was ready. I hired a sign company, the only contractor who didn't walk away from me, and had them install a sign bolted firmly to the ground just inside the swamp. It was metal, professional, and had 3 specific logos: the USACE logo, the Clean Water Act emblem, and the text in aggressive, federal black font. Official notice: U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Area of Jurisdictional Wetlands. Activity prohibited without Section 404. Permit fines up to $40,000 per day. No trespassing. It was beautiful. It was majestic. It was my Declaration of Independence from Kentucky bluegrass. Precisely at 9:00 a.m., the time the NA had threatened to bring their wrecking crew, Brenda and Gary marched onto my driveway. They were flanked by a burly man in a neon vest, clearly their hired contractor, who looked ready to demolish something. Brenda stopped dead when she saw the sign. She looked at the USACE logo, then the fine print, then back at me. I was sitting on my front porch swing, sipping coffee and reading a highly detailed brochure on local amphibian species. "Miles!" Brenda's voice was high-pitched, the calm veneer finally cracking. "What in the name of God is this?" I lowered my brochure. "Why, Brenda, it's a courtesy. You mentioned you wanted to hire a contractor to perform forced clearance, remember? Well, I thought it best to warn your employee about the prevailing legal limitations of the site." The contractor, who was already looking uneasy, stepped back. "Wait, a wetland? That's Army Corps of Engineers stuff. That's federal." "Indeed," I confirmed cheerfully. "Under the Clean Water Act. That means if you or anyone else, including the neighborhood association, digs up so much as a zucchini, the federal government views it as a major environmental violation. And they don't mess around with fines, especially for dredge and fill activity." I walked over, picked up the framed letter, and handed Brenda a laminated copy of the USACE determination. "Here is the official notice, Brenda. Signed, sealed, and delivered. This property is now a protected federal jurisdiction. Your covenant requiring me to remove the vegetation now forces you, the NA, to violate federal law. Which rule trumps, Brenda? The shade of my mulch or the Clean Water Act?" Brenda read the document. Her face went through 5 distinct stages of grief: disbelief, anger, sputtering, silent rage, and finally a sort of terrifying, defeated resignation. "This is an absurdity, Miles. You created this. You deliberately engineered this swamp." "I didn't create anything, Brenda. The soil composition, the hydrology, the presence of specific indicator species, it's all pre-existing, naturally occurring ecological conditions," I lied smoothly. "All I did was have it certified by an engineer, and now if you want to enforce your $250 fine by destroying the habitat, You'll be facing a federal felony and potential fines that could bankrupt the entire neighborhood association. I suggest you consult your legal counsel. Perhaps they can help you draft the USACE Section 404 mitigation plan required to dig up my weeds. The hired contractor was already halfway to his truck. Yeah, I'm out. I don't mess with the Corps. That's like 1,000,000 permits, lady. Good luck with the swamp, man. Brenda stood there, clutching the laminate, a portrait of impotent rage. The skirmish was won, but the war, as I soon learned, was far from over. Brenda, unable to use bureaucratic force or hired muscle, chose the oldest, least effective method of neighbor dispute resolution: calling the cops. It happened around 4:00 p.m. that same day. I was adding a new layer of mulch, wetland friendly, naturally, when 2 local police cruisers pulled up. Officer Miller, who looked about 50 and utterly exhausted by suburban drama, and Officer Davis, a rookie who looked 22 and terrified, exited their cars. I walked over to the edge of the USACE protected area, trying to look as innocent as a man holding a bag of compost can look. "Afternoon, officers. Beautiful day for a federal jurisdiction, isn't it?" I greeted them. Officer Miller rubbed his temples. "Miles, we received a call regarding an illegal structure being erected, refusal to grant access to private property, and general civil unrest." "Ah, civil unrest. That's Brenda's official term for 'I didn't get my way,'" I said, leaning casually against the USACE sign. "Let's address the charges. Which illegal structure are we talking about? The shed? Fully permitted. The fence? Original to the property. Or this?" I tapped the large black and white metal sign. "That sign," Officer Miller stated flatly. "Well, officer, this isn't an illegal structure. This is a mandated notification device required by federal law, specifically the Army Corps of Engineers, to denote the boundary of a protected jurisdictional wetland. Removing it, or asking me to remove it, would constitute interference with federal enforcement protocol. I'm just trying to keep your records clean." Officer Davis, the rookie, looked increasingly confused. "Sir, I don't think the Army Corps regulates neighborhood landscaping." "That's where Section 404 of the Clean Water Act comes in, Officer Davis. It regulates the discharge of dredge and fill material into waters of the United States, which, thanks to our local drainage issues and the presence of typha and juncus, includes this half-acre right here," I explained with the patience of a very sarcastic professor. "The neighborhood association wants me to fill this wetland with sod and dredge the existing soil. That requires a federal permit. If you or they step onto the protected jurisdiction to enforce a municipal code, you are effectively performing an illegal dredge and fill operation without a permit." Officer Miller held up a hand. Wait. You're telling me that this mud puddle is a federal wetland?" "Confirmed by a licensed engineer and officially designated by the USACE. I have the certified documentation right here. If you'd like to see the low chroma soil report and the facultative wetland species summary," I offered, reaching for my pocket. Officer Miller quickly waved the offer away. "No, thank you, Miles. We do not get involved in federal environmental law." He looked at Officer Davis, who was staring wide-eyed at the plastic flamingos. "But officer," Davis whispered, "the caller, Mrs. Hawthorne, said he was denying contractors access to their private property to perform necessary maintenance." "Ah, refusal of access," I chirped. "I'm not refusing access, officer. I'm preventing unauthorized access for the officer's own financial protection. The fine for unpermitted disturbance of this jurisdiction is up to $40,000 per day. Officer Miller, if you step over the line, you could be fined. I'm not denying them entry. I'm giving them an official, federal, health and safety warning. I'm just protecting their personal finances, really." Miller groaned, a sound of pure, middle-aged existential despair. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3. We are on Primrose Lane. The alleged civil dispute appears to involve a federal environmental designation. Repeat, federal environmental designation. Yes, the Army Corps of Engineers. Stand by for clarification." He waited for a moment, then spoke into the radio again. "Negative, dispatch. This is strictly a civil issue that has escalated beyond local jurisdiction. We are clearing the scene. Advise Mrs. Hawthorne to seek guidance from the Neighborhood Association's legal counsel regarding Section 404 permitting." Miller looked at me, a flicker of grudging respect in his tired eyes. "Miles, don't push it." "Wouldn't dream of it, officer. I'm just enjoying the local biodiversity," I said, picking up my brochure. Officer Miller turned and started walking quickly back to his cruiser. Officer Davis paused, stared at the sign one last time, glanced at the suspiciously pristine plastic flamingos, and then hurried after Miller, still looking deeply confused about how a patch of mud had just pulled rank on the local police department. The second confrontation was over. The forces of conformity had been repelled by the power of 3 specific bureaucratic words: federally protected wetland. I stood victorious amidst the tall weeds, the tomatoes, and the highly protected plastic wading birds. The only sound was the chirp of a local cricket and the rustle of the USACE sign in the breeze. The immediate aftermath of the federal designation was a deep, satisfying quiet, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic, distant sound of Brenda calling a lawyer. The war was technically won, but the real fun, the sustained, glorious mockery, was just beginning. I fully embraced my new role as the wetland steward, or as Leo dubbed me, the swamp lord of Aspen Knoll. My first official act was to enhance the federally protected boundaries. I couldn't build a fence. That would be fill activity and require a new Section 404 permit. But I could certainly add more official-looking advisory signage. I grabbed my label maker and created a series of laminated, highly detailed warnings, positioning them strategically around the perimeter of the USACE sign. Caution. Federally protected newt crossing. Habitat disturbance strictly prohibited. Wetland wildlife observation post. Please remain 15 feet back to avoid startling the endangered lawn gnomes. Note to Neighborhood Association. Disposal of unapproved mulch, sod, or petunias into this jurisdiction is a federal violation. See CFR 328.3A for details. Do not feed the hydrophytic vegetation. The absurdity was palpable, and it worked like a charm. Neighbors, who had previously glared at my yard, now approached with a mixture of confusion and awe. They wouldn't dare cross the imaginary, invisible, federal boundary. The protected area was a perfect, beautiful bubble of chaos in the middle of a conformity factory. I used the federal status to get rid of other annoying neighborhood issues. The NA had an absurd rule about where I could store my recycling bins. I simply moved them just inside the wetland boundary. When Gary, now the acting NA president, Brenda had gone on a stress-induced sabbatical, hesitantly approached me about the bin placement, I explained, "Gary, I'm sorry, but this area must remain in its prior converted state, and that includes establishing a waste management protocol that minimizes human disturbance to the hydrological features. My current setup utilizes the low-lying basin to prevent runoff contamination into the wider watershed. Removing them would disrupt the delicate flow." Gary just stared at the giant green bin sitting a foot deep in mud, shrugged, and walked away. The man was broken. The Clean Water Act had defeated him. The local news picked up the story within 2 weeks. I first knew I was famous when a white van with a giant antenna and the logo of Channel 7 News parked directly in front of my house. The reporter, a young woman named Chelsea, looked visibly thrilled by the absurdity of the situation. "Mr. Miles, you successfully fought the neighborhood association's demands to remove your garden by having it declared a federal wetland. Can you explain the process to our viewers?" she asked, sticking a microphone in my face, while the camera zoomed in on the "You Sace" sign. I gave them exactly the kind of sound bites Brenda feared most. "Well, Chelsea, I just believe in letting nature take its course. If the earth wants to be soggy and support a unique collection of highly protected weeds, who am I to argue?" All I did was point out to the government that my yard, technically, qualifies as waters of the United States. I simply used their own deeply complicated rule book against them. It's a victory for democracy, for sarcasm, and for this magnificent patch of cattails. And what about the residents who complain it affects their property values? Property values are subjective. Federal protection is not, I countered, putting on my most serious face. I would argue that living next to a certified federal environmental jurisdiction is a massive amenity. Where else can you find a rare avian protection zone, complete with the very serious, very pink Flamingo aquaticus, within a quarter-mile of a zero-lot line subdivision? It's priceless. The segment went viral locally. I became the reluctant hero of every resident who had ever received a passive-aggressive NA warning about Christmas lights or garage sale signage. Suddenly, I was getting supportive emails and cryptic notes shoved under my door. The publicity created a very interesting new wave of interactions. The contractor redux. Tony, the gruff construction guy who had scoffed at my Viking funeral for tomatoes, showed up unannounced one afternoon. "Miles, man, I saw you on the news," Tony said, looking sheepish. "Tony, you're looking well. Still refusing to handle legally sensitive biodegradable remains?" I asked. "Listen, I wanted to apologize. I didn't know you were serious about the federal thing. That's big time. That's real liability," he admitted. "Look, my company specializes in environmentally sound construction now. I could install a USACE-compliant, mitigated boardwalk through your wetland. I'd use non-impact piers, zero-discharge equipment. We could even get a plaque. The Tony Memorial Boardwalk, a path through bureaucracy." The irony was thicker than the hydric soil. He had refused to dig up a zucchini for $4,000, but he was willing to build me a multi-thousand-dollar nature walk to avoid a federal fine. "Tony, that's a very generous offer," I said, genuinely amused. "But I'll be honest with you. The beauty of a wetland is its natural, untamed inefficiency. It's supposed to be difficult to navigate. If I put in a boardwalk, Brenda might try to jog on it. The whole point is that it's inaccessible. Besides, I kind of like the natural mud squish under my boots. It helps me commune with the junkus." "Right. Natural inefficiency. Got it," Tony said, clearly writing the term down as a new business strategy. "Just, if you ever need a very small, ecologically sensitive, temporary fill operation for, say, a hot tub, I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who has a permit." "I'll keep it in mind, Tony, but I think the Flamingo aquaticus prefers the natural spring-fed jacuzzi," I replied, sending him off. The most satisfying part of the falling action, however, was the final, spectacular collapse of the NA's offensive. It had been about 4 weeks since the police incident. The fines had stopped. I found out why when Leo sent me a text. "Urgent. Mandatory NA meeting. Bring popcorn. Brenda is going thermonuclear. The meeting was packed. People had come just to watch the show. Brenda wasn't behind the podium. She was sitting at a side table, looking like a discarded beige doll, surrounded by two very expensive-looking lawyers. The meeting was chaired by the new temporary president, a nervous accountant named Bob. Bob cleared his throat repeatedly. "Good evening, residents. We have to address the Miles Wetland litigation issue." One of the lawyers, a sharp, humorless woman named Ms. Chen, took the floor. Her tone was clinical and damning. The Neighborhood Association Legal Counsel has advised the board that any continuation of legal action against Mr. Miles regarding the property at 142 Primrose Lane is to cease immediately. Further, any attempt to force the removal of the federally designated wetland vegetation would constitute a violation of the Clean Water Act, exposing the association to potential fines far exceeding our entire annual operating budget. A woman in the front row gasped audibly. Ms. Chen continued, reading from a dense report. To pursue a clearance, the NA would be required to file a Section 404 permit application, submit a mitigation plan, and potentially purchase wetland mitigation credits to compensate for the disturbance. The estimated cost for even exploring this process is well over $50,000. The risk is simply too high for a private residential association. Then she dropped the final, beautiful bomb. Furthermore, the existing covenants, specifically Section 3.b, subsection 7, which addresses exterior flora, are likely preempted by federal law in this specific instance. Therefore, any fines previously issued to Mr. Miles are legally invalid and must be rescinded immediately. I looked over at Brenda. She looked like she had aged 20 years since the police visited. This was the moment of her spectacular, dialogue-heavy meltdown. She lunged to her feet, knocking over her chair. "This is an outrage! We let one man turn a perfectly good lawn into a swamp because of some obscure regulation. He did this out of spite, pure, unadulterated spite. You are going to let him ruin our property values and let the whole neighborhood turn into a goddamned bog." She pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "You think you've won, Miles? You think you've defeated the rule of law?" I rose slowly. I decided to use Brenda's own weapon, calm, precise formality, against her. "Madam Former President," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "I didn't defeat the rule of law. I simply pointed out that the federal government's rules take precedence over the bylaws governing the shade of your mailbox. I acted within the framework of environmental protection, utilizing existing legal statutes to defend my right to grow food and preserve local biodiversity. If you are suggesting that adherence to federal law is spiteful, I believe that says more about the association's priorities than it does about my gardening habits." I sat down. Brenda stared at me for another agonizing 10 seconds, her face red, her hands trembling. She then threw her laminated NA badge onto the table. "I quit. I cannot serve a community that allows itself to be ruled by cattails and pink plastic birds." She stormed out of the clubhouse, the sound of her furious, defeated steps echoing through the parking lot. It was glorious. The meeting descended into chaos, but for me, the fight was over. The NA was reeling, legally neutralized, and morally defeated. I walked out into the cool evening air, feeling lighter than I had in years. I had not only saved my garden, I had forced an entire neighborhood to accept that my mess was legally and environmentally necessary. Months passed. The Aspen Knoll Neighborhood Association had quietly imploded, reforming into a much weaker, significantly more cautious body focused primarily on approving, acceptable shades of roof shingle. They were traumatized. They had learned the hard way that when you push a guy too far, he might just bring the full, confusing weight of the federal government down on your suburban planning committee. My fines were all officially rescinded, and I received an apology letter from the new NA president, Bob, which was so heavily vetted by lawyers it was completely devoid of human feeling. It was still a win. The swamp, meanwhile, thrived. The heavy rains of summer actually validated Dr. Sterling's report, turning the lower basin into a genuine, if small, marshy ecosystem. I spotted a couple of frogs, real, non-plastic ones, and the sunflowers reached truly ridiculous heights. I even built a small, slightly leaning wooden platform just outside the protected boundary where I could sit and watch the taifa grow. I called it the observation deck, and I held court there. The absurdity of the situation faded into local legend. People stopped complaining about my yard and started incorporating it into their tours. And over here, kids, is where Miles fought the man and won using the Clean Water Act. Don't touch the weeds. My victory was complete. It wasn't just about the tomatoes. It was about staking a claim for individual freedom and a little bit of beautiful, necessary mess in a world obsessed with sterile perfection. One late autumn afternoon, I was out on the observation deck, trimming a rogue squash vine that was threatening to colonize a rare Flamingo aquaticus when I saw a car pull up next door. The house next to mine, formerly owned by a couple who moved out shortly after Brenda's public meltdown, had finally sold. A woman in her late 20s, wearing jeans and a genuinely perplexed expression, stepped out of the house and walked up to my fence line. She looked nice. Too nice for Aspen Knoll. "Hi," she said, peering cautiously over the small chain-link barrier. "You must be Miles. I'm Clara. I just moved in next door." "Clara, welcome to the neighborhood," I replied, giving her my most neutral, non-crazy smile. "Just be careful of the boundary line. You're standing maybe 6 inches from a federally protected habitat." She laughed, a genuine, uncynical sound. "Right. I heard the stories. The entire closing process involved an appendix dedicated solely to the Adjacent Jurisdictional Wetland Liability Waiver. My lawyer just kept shaking his head. Ah, the sweet music of environmental law, I mused. I'm glad my legacy preceded me." She pointed at the large, official USACE sign, then at the ridiculous plastic flamingos, which now looked like sentinels guarding the gates of ecological anarchy. "So I'm genuinely curious," she said, leaning against the fence. "How did you pull this off? It's magnificent, by the way. My last NA fined me $50 for having a slightly off-white window blind." "That's exactly why I did it, Clara. I got tired of the tyranny of the taupe. I just looked at my yard, saw the terrible drainage, and decided that if they wanted to treat my life like a regulatory issue, I would fight back with better regulation." I reached into the swamp and pulled out a perfect, still ripe red pepper. The key is to take their own rulebook and wield it with extreme surgical precision. They wanted me to clean up. I showed them that cleaning up would violate the Clean Water Act, incur massive federal fines, and potentially endanger the local Juncos population. They backed down, because when it comes to who you want mad at you, the HOA or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it's not even a question. Clara took the pepper. "I mean, it's genius, but it looks like a ton of work. Is it hard to maintain? The protected wetland, I mean. The bureaucracy." I took a deep breath of the surprisingly earthy, muddy air and looked out over my creation. The wild vines, the tall grass, the buzzing insects. It was a riot of color and life, a tiny rebellion. Hard to maintain? Nah, I said, shaking my head. I looked at Clara, gave her a wink, and delivered the final, snarky summary of the entire saga. The government handles the legal stuff, the rain handles the water, and the sheer power of petty revenge handles the rest. Want a pepper? They grow great in protected jurisdictions. She laughed, bit into the pepper, and looked over at her pristine, sodded lawn with a thoughtful look. The Swamp Lord had a new neighbor, and maybe, just maybe, a new disciple.